So this is a three-part series, and I'm glad to hear what you have to say. I was thinking we were going to break it up into, again, there are three major works. I was thinking we'd spend a week on each, but maybe if you have the consensus, we'll do 2 weeks on the Guide to the Perplexed, which is fine. Happy to do that. That's great. So a couple things I want to say about Maimonides, and one thing I'd like to say is that there are many, many books about him and about things. I know I just want to honor you and your friend. This is one of the books Amnon brought, but you can certainly find much written on him. So if you want to say a word about the book for a moment, and we'll pass it along.
Yeah, this is written by a friend of mine, Joel Kramer. He's a emeritus professor at the University of Chicago, and he's a world-class expert on the Rambam. The most exciting thing I can remember, Joel was my neighbor in Israel, and I can remember the time he went to the Bodleian Library at Oxford and actually read the pieces of script that were found by the Rambam, and then wrote at his first paper on the Rambam on what he found in the library there. So it's a good book. It's divided into different sections. You can look at it. I'll just pass it around.
Great. So that's one of many, many. If you're intrigued or troubled or whatever you are, there's always something, there's what to read. And I also want to mention, just do honor to Dr. Rabin and his education. Do you want to mention Professor Tversky?
Right. Many moons ago, I had the opportunity to study at the Hebrew University with Rabbi Isidore Tversky.
He was a professor at Harvard for a long time.
And he came prepared to teach Rambam at a high level, and we as undergraduate students were prepared at a level below his, but we jumped as high as we could to catch morsels, and he was pretty patient with us, to be honest, and it was a great inspiration to me to hear about that.
One of his classic texts is the seminal work, The Guide to the Mishnah Torah, which you can find in used bookstores, and it's just called The Guide to the Mishnah Torah. It's this big, and it's tough getting through, but it's be used as a resource book. That's Isidore Tversky. Interesting, come from the famous Tversky family that you may know. So anyway, so we are going to speak a little bit about sort of the beginnings of Maimonides, born in the 12th century in Cordoba in Spain, and died just at the beginning of the 13th century in Egypt. And there's a lot of things to be said about him specifically. This is not necessarily a biographical class, because I figured you could look at that stuff. However, he had 3 major places that he lived, just so we can do that. And has anybody been to Cordoba in Spain?
Yeah.
Okay, has anybody seen the famous Maimonides statue?
Yeah.
Okay. So he lived there for a while, and then when he was a young man, in his 20s, 30s, he lived in Fez in Morocco, which is just to the south. So he lived there for a period of time, and then after a period of wandering, he moved to Fustat in Egypt, Old Cairo in Egypt, and that's where he became known as Naila, as the great doctor. And it's very interesting to hear and to think about him. And there's I don't know if it's controversy, but there's thought about how he was a product of his time, certainly, which we'll talk about today, and reacting not only to the hegemonic, let's say, Islamic culture that was there, and during his lifetime, there was a ruling family from Morocco, from the Berber clan, that sort of entered into Spain and made things a little bit more difficult. So much so that there are some scholars who contend that he and his family actually converted to Islam, or were forced to convert to Islam. Whether or not it was true, that's always you can go to the Maimonides conventions and have a good time. Or maybe it happened, but it wasn't a real one, whatever. So that's one of the reasons why perhaps they fled to Morocco. And then moving to Egypt, he had a brother, Maimonides named David, or David, and he was supposed to, according to one of the stories, to make things, secure the family fortune, and there was a particular way he was going to do it, through trade in Africa. And for one reason or another, David got onto a ship bound for India with all of the family wealth, and the ship sank. And David died, and so did the Maimonides' sort of thoughts and dreams. And so he had learned He had taken a couple of undergraduate courses in medicine, so he applied himself, like Dr. Rabin was saying, to becoming a doctor because he had to, and he ultimately became a doctor for the ruling family, the Sultan family in Old Fustat in Cairo. And from there, he did what he did. Another thing I just want to say, and I'm pleased by all means if there's things that by no means am I a Maimonides scholar. It's certainly something that is a cornerstone of my study. And just something to mention, some of you may know or don't know that I'm part of this thing called the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. I've begun to be, it's called a Hartman Fellow. And that's a 3-year commitment to being in Jerusalem twice a year to study, plus all year, every week. And the head of that study, who just passed away this last year, David Hartman, was noted as a formidable Maimonides scholar. So that's it's sort of rooted, the study that I'm doing is rooted in Maimonides studies. It's not just going through texts, it's sort of learning a little bit more on a larger level what's going on. And one of his proteges, who's a very hot, well-known scholar in Israel now, his name is Micha Goodman, who you may or may not know, who actually, very interestingly, just wrote a book on the Kuzari from Yehuda Halevi, and it's an academic book. It became a bestseller in Israel. I mean, imagine, right? Jonathan wrote it and it became like a New York Times bestseller.
The Kuzari is fairly easy to read too, isn't it?
Could be,
Interesting.
but it's his
subject.
commentary, it's his
Yeah.
sort of thought, and it
Yeah.
selling like wildfire.
That's great.
So this is Micha Goodman, who's steeped in this, and I have the privilege to learn from him every week.
Wow.
So there's there. One other thing I just want to mention about Maimonides, and I would love to hear if you have vignettes or thoughts about Maimonides also, is that if back in the day, and I've known you can maybe help me or others who sort of grew up sort of versed in Judaism, maybe Eileen, also for you, maybe, that the traditional beginning point for people to learn Hebrew was not Rosetta Stone back in the day. There were two aspects, two gateways into Judaism and into Hebrew specifically. The first was starting as a young child, as a young student, with, believe it or not, the book of Leviticus. And that's sort of how it began, because that's sort of like, tachlis, sort of what's going on. But to learn Hebrew was actually, people began to read the Mishnah Torah. Because the Mishnah Torah, his great magnum opus, was written in a very clear, very beautiful, very literary Hebrew. Very rich Hebrew. He may repeat himself from time to time. However, it's a Hebrew that is eminently understandable. It's not biblical Hebrew. It's not Mishnaic Hebrew, which can be difficult, which we'll look at in a minute. But it's specifically a Hebrew that he crafted. That is, if we don't have a Shakespeare per se, but it's the greatest to this date ways of presenting Hebrew. So if we're interested in learning Hebrew, also, Mishnah Torah is very long and it's many volumes and there's a lot there. But it might be a nice thing even to develop a chavruta or something if you're interested to practice the Hebrew, because the Hebrew is magisterial. So that's one thing. So his later work, the one that you mentioned, The Guide to the Perplexed, is actually written in Judeo-Arabic, which is a language not really anybody knows. It was translated into a really difficult Hebrew by the Ibn Tibbon family, and I have a copy of that, but good luck with that. And so reading that in English is perfectly acceptable, but it's still very difficult, even with the translation to the translation. So that's just a beginning of thinking about Maimonides, and I'll speak a little bit about sort of his project and why Dr. Rabin quoted this thought from Moshe to Moshe, from Moses to Moses. There was no other Moshe, and that's quote attributed to Maimonides himself. So we'll do that. But I want to pause if you have thoughts and things that you want to bring to our study, and then we'll jump into to one of the texts. Does anybody have something they want to contribute or think about? Or
Well, Maimonides himself was inspired by the Hebrew of Onkelos, who wrote in the time of the writing of the Talmud. And of course, Maimonides was looking for the kind of Hebrew that he felt most people could read. By most people, I don't mean the average person. I mean those who already were scholarly enough to read the Hebrew, that they should have a choice of kind of Hebrew that has most meaning. And so, as much as we are inspired by the Rambam's writing, he too was inspired by somebody who was before him. And I always think that that's a nice thing.
That's great. And one thing I just wanted to mention, you raise a really great point, is who's the audience, is exactly right. That's a debate also at the Maimonides conventions. We can all go. That'd be so fun, right? So that's a very good point. And the other thing is that, like any artist, not like any scholar, but like any artist, he didn't necessarily quote his sources. So the Mishnah Torah is done without footnotes. So even though it's a thought about Jewish tradition, which I'll mention in just a second, it's not like see Genesis 14 or see the Talmud here and there. He just assumed that you would have all of the texts at your fingertips or on a concordance or something. So that's a difficult thing if you're looking to place Maimonides in a scholarly context. It's something that Maimonides scholars have been grappling with for a long time.